I was in Lebanon 10 months ago talking to refugees in one of the Palestinian camps there outside of Beirut, the Burj al Barajna, and where it was a camp where you've got 22,000 people living in 1 square kilometre. So of course how they live is by going up, and so you get this medieval city effect whereby people building up and up, and they close over the alleyways. The alleyways are unmade because the Lebanese government doesn't recognise the existence of the refugee camps. It says, well, if it recognised them, that would recognise de facto, you know, Israel's right to have expelled these people. But what they do is refuse to have formal electricity connections to the camp. And so when you go through these unmade alleyways, you've got this morass of wires over the top. But then on top of that, dripping down is water that's drawn up from the aquifer beneath the refugee camp. It's drawn up tanks. It's very, very salty. It's used more or less for cleaning purposes. So there you get numerous accidents, you know, from the this sort of makeshift electricity supply. And it was no accident that when I was in Gaza in the course of the same tour, which was a tour that was sponsored by a feeder, the overseas aid arm of the ACTU, that I saw people in hospital in Gaza who, because of the restrictions on the electricity supply there, were making do with you know, these makeshift electricity arrangements. And of course you get children suffering and young people, anyone virtually can suffer quite horrific burns as a result of it. But I suppose, and of course I'm not the only one here, Vivian Pujol is in the audience with me. She's joining me on the flotilla together with a social worker, Michael Coleman, who's going. Vivian belongs to Jews for Peace in Jews for Peace, and basically is a member of the Jewish diaspora, who are very widespread throughout both Australia and of course Europe and the North and South America, but many members of which are very much opposed to Israeli activities, both in the occupied territories and in Gaza in particular. It's very interesting, the situation there, because we're seeing, with the overthrow of the Mubarak regime there, but it's only been an overthrow really of the figureheads of that regime. The military still remains very much in power, and those demonstrations earlier in the year, which you may have seen in Tahrir Square in Cairo, amongst the demands that were being thrown up was to free Palestine. And of course, with the people of Egypt, with the crossing, the Egyptian government has been very complicit with the Israeli authorities in closing the crossing from Egypt into Gaza at Rafah. And of course, that is also the place where the tunnels exist. Now, why I mention that is tonight we were interviewed for the George Negus program in Channel 10, and they did a very brief segment tonight. And the whole thrust of that segment, my interpretation was, well, this is a needlessly provocative act, and there's no need for the flotilla at all, because after all, with the opening of the Rafah crossing, that things are going to be perfectly okay in Gaza. But of course, Gaza is a situation where 80% of the people there are dependent upon handouts from the United Nations, where the sewage treatment works, because it was bombed and it's unable to send in material to have it repaired. It sends something like 800,000 litres of raw sewage into the Mediterranean every day. It's a situation where the United Nations runs a number of schools. It can't rebuild many of the schools I think there were 30 in all during Operation Cast Lead. 11 of those were completely demolished, and the remaining 19 or 20 were very seriously damaged. But because building materials are not permitted in, those schools can't be rebuilt, and so the United Nations itself has indicated that there's something like 44,000 children it's had to turn away at the beginning of the school year. When I was there, I saw children, the UN, and of course Hamas runs camps as well, but we went into the UN compound that had been damaged during Operation Cast Lead, and even they couldn't get in the materials to rebuild that. But the UN was running summer camps because it's very, very hot in Gaza in the July-August period. They were running summer camps for children there, and of course it's right on the edge of the sea. The trouble is, about a kilometre from where the children were swimming and where their camps were, was where the raw sewage was entering the sea. So you can imagine just the contamination. And of course that contamination is not just in the seawater, but it also is affecting the water sources, the aquifer beneath Gaza itself. I saw, for example, out at Gaza International Airport, which had been bombed and built, brand new spanking airport, built in the late 1990s. In about 2002, 2003, it had been bombed by the Israelis. At the moment, all you see is a few walls, you know, sort of standing. It's completely unusable as an airport. But what is usable is the material that's been laid down as the base for the runways. And that, because people are so desperate to rebuild their housing, many people go out to the airport and gather the base material and take it back, because I understand it's quite good building materials. But it's incredibly hot, it's incredibly dirty work. When we were there, it was hot, it was dirty, and there's this wind blowing, and you had at least 2, possibly 3, even more, 300 people, even more, families with their donkey carts going out, picking up by hand this building material and taking it back. And you would have to conclude that this would be the poorest of the poor in Gaza, this desperate scrabble for building materials. The day after we were there, the Israelis bombed that airport. Now, I view that as a complete war crime, because that airport had no strategic significance whatsoever. You could never see a plane landing or taking off from there. The whole purpose of it was, in fact, to intimidate, to strike fear in the hearts of the Gazan people, to render them hopeless, and in effect, sort of become, eventually give up and allow the Israelis to pursue policies which amount to ethnic cleansing of not only of Gaza, but of course, the occupied territories itself. Because the majority of inhabitants, many of the inhabitants of Gaza, are refugees from Palestine itself. The suggestion is, after the Mavi Marmara, after the attack of the Mavi Marmara, the PR fallout for Israel was so bad that it announced that it was going to ease the blockade. But a report prepared in March of this year by a number of church groups, plus Oxfam and Amnesty International, it was entitled Dashed Hopes. And it goes through and analyses in great detail how, in fact, the easing has not resulted in any improvement, any greater, apart from, you know, a few face-saving truckloads of food possibly going in, but very little going out. It really hasn't improved the conditions of the people in Gaza at all. Because while there's a list, they published a list of items that would be no longer subject to exclusion from Gaza. To bring anything in requires a permit, and the Israelis are refusing to issue those permits. In effect, the blockade continues. Israel, the fishing industry, the fishermen in Gaza, are not permitted to go more than 3 nautical miles offshore, even though under the Oslo Accords they're supposed to be able to go up to 20 nautical miles. But of course, all the fish upon which they rely are beyond that 3 nautical miles. And any fishermen who venture out are fired upon by the Israeli Defence Force. And in fact, a study by the United Nations which looks at what's happening in Gaza concluded, in effect, well, one of the problems is the Israelis never make clear, actually, when you're, where are these specific boundaries? Because at sea, there's this lack of clarity, and on land, whilst they have established this green line and this electrified fence and whatever, there's also from that there's no man's land and areas which are quarantined from anyone entering. And again, no one's quite sure how far these extend. So in effect, 17% of the area, the official size of Gaza has, in fact, is inaccessible to the population of Gaza. So I can't, the Rafah crossing is just not is a crossing that is not equipped to handle the import of raw materials. So it's opened, but of course if you're a man between the ages of 18 and 40, you're not allowed to exit or enter Gaza. But there is now, with the easing of the restrictions, at least women and children can go out. But for people who are looking for work, in effect, the fact that they're not allowed to exit means that their chances of employment diminish. And that's the whole purpose of what the Israelis are doing. They're removing, absolutely destroying the viability of Gaza as an economic entity. So they're doing it by not only restricting that access to making it difficult to pursue agricultural fishing industries, but also by swamping, where they do allow goods in, they are allowing in Israeli-made goods, which are in direct competition with goods that were earlier manufactured, such as clothing, which were major manufacturers in Gaza and which were being exported beyond beyond Gaza. So they're destroying the economy. They're endeavouring to break the will of the people of Gaza and, indirectly, the will of the Palestinian people. But as I can just revert very briefly, when I went to that refugee camp in Lebanon and spoke to refugees, some of whom were from the 1948, when the State of Israel was created, and others were refugees from 1967, there was this absolute determination that they insisted on the right of return. And for people to turn around and say, well, you should give that up, it's like telling the Aboriginal community in this country that you should give up any pretence to land rights. But the attachment, the sense of outrage, the sense of injustice that these people experience mean that they and their children will never give up. But the conditions of life which they experience mean that their children, who face, for many, many cases, face a fairly, really not quite hopeless, but incredibly despairing prospects of, despairing life chances. If there was ever a way to create a militant opposition, then certainly the Israelis, backed of course by the United States, are doing it hell-bent together pursuing that course. So when we go on the Gaza, it'll be very interesting. None of us are under any illusion that the Israelis are going to sit back and ignore it. We don't know what to anticipate, but when you weigh up what the people of both Palestine and Gaza go through every day, any risks that we run are relatively minor. Thank you.